Hello, and welcome to another video in our series of videos analyzing the relationship between formation of political entities and trade. In this video, we're going to discuss sub-Saharan African trade and polities. Now, we're not going to discuss the very earliest African polities, that is ancient Egypt. We're not going to talk about the Mediterranean era, so we're not discussing Carthage or ancient Rome. Instead, we're going to focus on other Asian polities that formed a little bit later. Now, one of the main features that distinguish early forms of political organizations in Africa is a phenomenon called the African Iron Age. Now, Iron Age started earlier, probably diffused from the Middle East, but it became widespread in the Niger River area by the year 550 BCE, before the Common Era. Now, iron smelting in some places happened or took place after farming had already been implemented much earlier. So farming preceded iron in Northwest and Central Africa. But in other places in East and Southern Africa, both farming and iron smelting spread almost simultaneously. So they go hand in hand in certain places of the continent. Now, iron tools enhanced cattle raising, and cattle actually became a very important marker of social status and repository of wealth in many societies across Africa, and remains an important feature of wealth and distinction in Africa, in certain places of Africa to this day. And iron tools enhanced cattle raising, and it also helped the further development of agriculture, facilitating population growth. Now, this combination of iron, cattle, and crops is what is called the Iron Age package, and we will see coming back and forth. This Iron Age package is associated with Bantu-speaking peoples who migrated across Africa, although there is some debate. Now, this Bantu expansion contributed largely and was facilitated by this package of iron, crops, and cattle. There are two routes, one following the western coast of Africa, and then there's another one going around the rainforest of Central Africa towards the Lake Victoria region, and then south into the Limpopo, the Zambezi and the Limpopo River basins. Now, these Bantu migrations took place over a long period of time. We're talking about 3,000 years between 2000 BCE and the year 1000. So it's a long, slow process. Now, sub-Saharan Africa developed trade early on, but there was this big barrier, and that's the Sahara Desert. Now, the Sahara has a main distinguishing feature, and it's that communications across this place are complicated. So communication across the Sahara is a complicated matter, and one needed a special technology to overcome the difficulties involved in traversing this vast expanse of sand. And this new technological innovation was, of course, the camel. So the camel was introduced to Egypt by the Romans in the 2nd century CE, and before that there were no camels in Egypt or anywhere in Africa. But by the year 300, they were being herded by the Berber people, the Amazigh people of the Maghreb region. Now, this widespread of the camel finally enabled the crossing of large caravans across the desert, taking advantage of a network of oases that were spread throughout the area. These contacts between the Mediterranean across the desert arrived at a place called the Sahel, and the Sahel is an area, a transitional area between the savannas to the south and the full-blown desert to the north. And the societies that inhabited this area of the Sahel were able to take advantage of that because they would trade the products from the north, mostly salt, but also leather and books and glassware and weapons and cloth, and exchange them for other products from the tropical regions, namely tree crops, yams, cola nuts, but most importantly, gold. So this can be considered a salt and gold trade route, because those were the two major products that were being traded alongside everything else. Now, these intermediaries took advantage of this strategic position and eventually grew into full-blown empires. And the first of these series of empires that constitute West Africa's golden age is the Empire of Ghana. And Ghana developed between the year 300 to the year 1100 CE. Not to be confused with present-day Ghana, this polity was ruled by the Soninke people from the city of Kumbi Saleh. And it's interesting to note that the rulership followed matrilineal rules of succession. That is, the sons of the king's sister would inherit rather than the king's own offspring. It became a major gold trading power and was famously wealthy. It took advantage of this position, transporting Trans-Saharan products from the north and tropical products from the south. And during the existence of this polity, the first contacts with Islam and partial conversion of its elites took place. However, the first full-blown Islamic empire in this region was the Empire of Mali that succeeded Ghana. Its golden age, or the most important part of the development of this state, was between the year 1230 and 1450. Now, importantly, not to be confused with present-day Mali, although present-day Mali does include certain areas of the Mali Empire. It had a powerful military based on cavalry. It had its height in the 14th century when it conquered Ghana and took over the gold trading routes. And it was ruled by a Malinke elite, which, like I said, were Muslims. These were called the kings of Mali were called the Mansas, and they ruled from the city of Niani. Now, they dominated the gold fields in Senegal and the Niger, and the Niger River basins. And this empire was visited by Ibn Battuta, one of the most important travelers of the medieval period. In fact, he traveled way more than Marco Polo, as we will see. Now, Mali continued to exist as a rump state much later than the 15th century. In fact, it was only finally destroyed in 1670, so it was a long-lasting polity. Now, the Empire of Mali is famous, and it contributed in many ways to world culture. First off, the Sundiata Keita or Sundiata epic is the most important epic preserved in Africa. Has been preserved through oral tradition in the same vein as the Iliad or the Arthuric cycle, and it retells the story of Sundiata Keita, the founder of the Mali Empire. We also have depictions of Mali in the Catalan Atlas, which is a very famous map drawn in the city of Mallorca by Abraham Crescas in 1375, and it's now preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. Now, in this atlas, in this map, we can see the camel caravans traversing the desert, and we can see sitting in his throne Mansa Musa, the king of Mali, the most famous king of Mali. In fact, Mansa Musa is reportedly the richest man to have ever lived, because when he took on when he did his Hajj, when he went on pilgrimage to the city of Mecca, he stopped in Cairo for a little bit, and he traveled with a lot of wealth in a huge caravan and a huge supply train with many camels and animals and slaves and people and courtiers that traveled along with him, and enormous amounts of gold. And he actually gave out part of this gold in Egypt as part of the Muslim obligation of charity. And in fact, he gave out so much gold that he caused hyperinflation, from which Egypt would not recover until many years after having been visited by Mansa Musa. That's how rich he was. Upon his return, he fostered the development of learning institutions back in Mali, in what is called the University of Timbuktu, which is not a university like we understand it today, but rather it was a series of teachings where students were trained in Quranic learning, mathematics, geometry, and Arabic, among other subjects, across different mosques in the city. And these mosques also had extensive collections of manuscripts about art, medicine, philosophy, science that are still preserved. Those are the so-called Timbuktu manuscripts. So it was an important center of learning. Speaking of mosques, during this time, the construction of the Great Mosque of Djenné, which is today the same as Timbuktu, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site today. But the building that you can see today was actually built in 1907 over the earlier building of the 13th century. So Mali was succeeded by another empire, the Songhai Empire. The Songhai were originally a small kingdom centered further east in the city of Gao. It was subjugated by Mali, but became independent in the 1430s and conquered Mali in turn. It was able to expand thanks to cavalry and infantry-loaded boats developed by his founder, Sunni Ali. Later on, it was consolidated by the Askaya dynasty, but that lasted a century, between 1493 until 1591, when it was conquered by Morocco. So let's briefly talk about this Moroccan imperialism, and it's associated with a particular ruler, Ahmad al-Mansur, who actually defeated, when he came to power, a pretender who was backed by the King of Portugal. And in fact, the King of Portugal died in this battle of Caserquibi in 1578. His body was never recovered, and his death actually prompted a succession crisis back in Portugal that will eventually lead to its the absorption of this kingdom into the Spanish crown under Philip II. Now, King al-Mansur was able to ransom hundreds of captured Portuguese noblemen and amass quite a bit of fortune. He developed his army further, and eventually he decided to take over the gold routes further down the south. And in order to do that, he commissioned an eunuch who had been born in Almeria called Judar Pasha. He was kidnapped as a baby by slave raiders, and he was in charge of this army. We will discuss this slave raiding in the Mediterranean in a future lecture. But Judar Pasha's army was not a very big army. It's only 4,000 soldiers, but they were armed with arquebuses and cannon. He took the Tagasa southwards, and later on advanced towards the capital of Gao. And there they were confronted by a very large army, 40,000 strong men. But despite this numerical difference, the weaponry that the Moroccans had on their side were able to win the day. So in many ways, this is similar to other engagements where we have smaller armies armed with gunpowder weapons being able to defeat much larger forces. And this is something similar to what happened in the Americas with the Spanish conquest. Funny that this instance also has a Spaniard as the leader, at least a Spanish-born person. Anywho, Ahmed al-Mansour had two projects to develop after his successes. One was a great palace to be built in Marrakech, and the other one was a transatlantic colonization project in the Americas. So there could have been Moroccan colonies in the Americas, but only one of those projects, the palace, of course, ever came to fruition. This is the El Badi Palace, which you can visit in Marrakech today. Now, what happened to the Sahelian state after Tondibi? Essentially, they fragmented. So we have political fragmentation and the end of this West Africa golden age as Trans-Saharan trade decayed in favor of European-controlled, Atlantic-centered commercial circuits that were based on slave trade and slavery. Further to the north, the Islamic polities of the Mediterranean also weakened somewhat and were less focused on Trans-Saharan trade. But we do have other polities in the Sahel apart from these three empires that we've discussed. Not all of them were empires. In fact, we have the Hausa city-states. There was a network of city-states that came to its zenith between the 11th and the 15th centuries, and were benefiting from these caravan trade routes as intermediaries between the Mali Empire and the Kanem Empire further to the east. This Kanem Empire extended from Lake Chad, which was a very fertile region in Central Africa, and it expanded between the years 700 and 1380, and it controlled major trade routes between Libya and the tropical regions to the south. It was succeeded by another empire called the Bornu polity, or the Bornu Empire, which continued to exist until 1900. So elsewhere, let's discuss the polities in the rainforest. And first, I'd like to talk about Ife. Ife was a city-state that flourished between 1200 and 1400. It was founded by the Yoruba people, and it's famous because of its sculptures made in bronze and terracotta, which showcase very naturalistic representations of the human body. This is 100 years before David's Michelangelo. So Michelangelo's David. So naturalistic art was not a European development exclusively. But more importantly, the Yoruba state of Ife is important because it fostered the cult of deities known as orishas. And this Yoruba religious tradition would be very important as it greatly influenced religious practices in the Americas, as we will see in a future lecture. Another of these polities of the rainforest was the city of Benin, not to be confused with present-day Benin, ruled by the Edo people. It expanded its power in the 15th century, thanks in part to its participation and benefit from slave trading, as it traded people from the Igbo, Sobo, and Ijao, among other peoples, with the European slavers. Now, another empire and another polity that did the same was Ashanti, which developed a little later in the 17th century. It was dominated by the Akan people and centered in the city of Kumasi, and it really consolidated its power only in the 18th century. Its kings ruled from the golden stool, which became a symbol of the Ashanti people, and it was able to field large, well-trained, disciplined army, with which it conquered neighboring peoples. Now, the prisoners made through those wars or received as tribute by the from the conquered peoples were traded as slaves to the Europeans. Similarly, and now we're leaving West Africa and moving much further down south, we have the Kingdom of Congo, which of course, again, not to be confused with the modern states of the Democratic Republic of Congo or the Republic of Congo. This kingdom engaged in diplomatic relations with Portugal in the 15th century. And in fact, one of his kings, pictured here, was baptized, was converted to Christianity, Joao I. He later on became an apostate, so he relinquished his Christian religion. But it's famous because he used firearms provided by the Portuguese to expand into the interior. Now, these three kingdoms we talk about, Benin, Kongo, and Ashanti, did participate in the slave trade. But, and this is very important, so important I wrote it down, it is extremely important to state that acknowledging the involvement in and profit from the transatlantic slave trade by African polities does not shift the blame from Europeans. Europeans were most definitely the architects of the economic system based on human trafficking that made slavery hugely profitable, and therefore they must categorically be regarded as the primary perpetrators of the tragic development in human history. That being said, there were African polities that participated very actively and benefited from slave trade. So moving completely out of West Africa, now we're at the eastern end of Africa, we have the Kingdom of Ethiopia. And unlike the other kingdoms that we've discussed thus far, this kingdom is the same as the present day state of Ethiopia. In fact, even before it was called Ethiopia, it existed as a kingdom, previously known as the Kingdom of Aksum. Its king converted to Coptic Christianity by the year 350 CE. So very close to the conversion of the Roman Empire. The Ethiopian kingdom also converted to Christianity. And in fact, the country continued to be dominated by a Christian elite. They continued to dominate this highland kingdom until being invaded by Mussolini in 1935. Of course, fascists were later kicked out, and the Ethiopian monarchy continued until a socialist coup finally ended this long succession of Ethiopian kings in 1974. One of the most impressive features of Christianity in Ethiopia is, of course, the site of the Lalibela rock-hewn churches. And these are 3-story high churches that are completely carved out of live rock. And here we have an example of the Church of St. George. And yes, this is the same St. George that you all know. And it was carved out of the rock around the year 1200, along with another 10 churches in the area. So from 1270, the kingdom was ruled by the Solomonic dynasty, who claimed descent from King Solomon of Israel. And yes, this is the King Solomon of the Bible. They claim descent from this king. Now, speaking of Israel, Ethiopia was also home to a very sizable Jewish community that flourished in the country for many centuries. The kingdom engaged in sporadic diplomatic contacts with Europe, especially beginning in the 15th century. Although contact was never fully lost, it was affected by the incursion of Islam in North Africa, of course. That severed the relationship somewhat. However, in the 15th century, we have a renewed interest of the Ethiopians towards Europe. Here we have a portrait of David II, King of Ethiopia, made in Europe. By the early 16th century, it actually became an ally of Portugal, and Portugal and the Ottoman Empire were actually engaged in proxy wars where Ethiopia was a contender. So it became part of the same geopolitics of the Ottomans and the Portuguese and the Spaniards. So Ethiopia was not always friendly towards the European Christians. In fact, King Fasilides expelled the Jesuit order from Ethiopia in 1633 and reinvigorated the earlier Coptic tradition of Ethiopia. He later on moved the capital to the city of Gondar in 1636 and built a huge castle complex, palace, if you will, right there in the city, which you can see in the picture. Now, moving further down south, we should talk about the polities that were forming in the southern savanna of Africa, because these two are connected to trade to the wider world. Now, this southern savanna saw the arrival and spread of Bantu-speaking peoples and the development of this Iron Age package that we've talked about at the beginning of this video, that is iron, crops, and cattle, between the year 300 and 1000 CE. There were various cultural traditions that developed in the region, and they engaged in ivory and gold production that began to be traded with the Indian Ocean circuit, which we will discuss in another video in more detail, by the 10th century CE. The most important of these centers was definitely Great Zimbabwe. Now, Great Zimbabwe flourished by the year 1300. Its major feature is the Great Enclosure, which you can see pictured here. And it was basically built to showcase the power, the prestige of the rulers, rather than for defensive purposes. Its impressive walls are 4.5 meters thick and up to 9 meters tall. So we're talking about quite substantial stone buildings. In fact, it's the largest stone ruins in Africa, south of the Nile River Valley. Now, Zimbabwe, it's not an isolated phenomenon. In fact, it's only the largest of a network of stone towns that were dispersed across the southern savanna in the present day state of Zimbabwe, Botswana, in that region. We're talking about, in the case of Great Zimbabwe, about a stratified society of about 20,000 people. Now, so a very substantial population. Great Zimbabwe, we find also evidence to suggest the development of divine kinship, symbolizing the Zimbabwe bird, pictured here, which became the symbol of the royalty of Great Zimbabwe, and it's still a symbol of the country of Zimbabwe today. The elite enjoy Indian Ocean trade imports, such as Persian ceramics, Chinese porcelain, glass beads from India that have been found in abundance in the site by archaeologists. However, the city was abandoned by 1500, perhaps due to exhaustion of available resources or disease, but not the possibility of an invasion has been ruled out by archaeologists. Successor states emerged in its wake. This was not the end of this stone building tradition in Africa. We have the state of Mutapa that endured until 1760, and Butua, or the Torowa dynasty, which lasted all the way until between 1450 and 1683. So a very long tradition as well. Finally, we reach the Swahili coast, and in the Swahili coast, we have the development of a network of some 40 Islamic independent city-states. So same as in Hausa, we have not necessarily a centralized unique authority. Instead, we have the development of local city elites that developed through commerce. Now, these cities were intermediaries between the gold, ivory, and slaves exporting centers in the interior and the Indian Ocean trade circuit. In fact, they would trade these goods, particularly with the Middle East region, in particular the slaves who would be used to grow sugarcane in that area of southern Mesopotamia. Now, the Swahili coast reached its zenith between the year 1000 and 1500 CE. And although there was a strong competition between the 40 different cities, we're talking about commercial rather than military competition. The biggest of these cities was perhaps the city of Kilwa, and you can see pictured here, the prayer room in the Great Mosque, which was completed in 1302. Now, it's important about the Swahili coast, the cosmopolitan character of the society that developed there. In fact, Swahili is a Bantu language that has many loan words from Arabic. In fact, the word Swahili comes from an Arabic word meaning coast. So there are many words borrowed from Arabic and Persian, to a lesser degree Persian and other languages, that enrich this Bantu language that developed there. In fact, it would become the lingua franca for the entire coast, and we're talking about a big area encompassing present-day Somalia all the way down to present-day Mozambique, and it remains today a major language in many countries in East Africa. So very important for future developments. Just a brief parenthesis, it's important to note that that several of these polities that we've discussed, namely the Songhai empires, but also the Hausa city-states and the Swahili coast city-states, but not Ethiopia and not the Great Zimbabwe, were part of the Islamic world. This Islamic world, in fact, became quite cohesive, although very cosmopolitan. And this is where the travels of Ibn Battuta take place. Ibn Battuta would take advantage of these commercial circuits that we've already discussed. He traveled to Timbuktu and Janneh and Niani in Africa from his hometown of Tangier in Morocco through these caravans, trade routes, Trans-Saharan trade routes. Later on, earlier than that, he had traveled to the Swahili coast as well. And as we can see, he even reached China. Now, Ibn Battuta reached China via another network, which we will discuss in much greater detail in another video, and that is the Indian Ocean Transoceanic Trade Network. So I will see you then when we discuss the trade network. But before that, I would like to recommend the Samani project. This is a fantastic website created by the University of Cape Town with 3D modeled recreations of many of the sites that we've discussed in this lecture. The Mosque of Janneh, the churches of Lalibela, the city of Gondar, the Mosque of Kilwa, and you can see 3D reproductions of these and a lot of pictures and videos. So it's highly recommended. So that can occupy your time in the meantime, and I'll see you for our next discussion. Goodbye.